I took the job at the Grayfield Water Reclamation Facility because my car insurance had lapsed, and my landlord had started leaving voicemails instead of texts, which in my experience meant the next step was a letter taped to my door. The listing on the county employment board said overnight monitoring technician, which sounded better than what it actually was. You sat in a control room and watched gauges, pressure readouts, and a bank of security feeds showing different sections of the plant. 11 at night to 7 in the morning. $14.60 an hour, shift differential included. No experience necessary. The facility sat about 9 miles outside of town, past the last subdivision, and down a county road that didn't have streetlights for the final 2-mile stretch. You could see it from a distance because of the sodium vapor lights mounted on tall poles around the perimeter fence. They gave everything that sick orange glow, the kind that makes your skin look jaundiced and turns every shadow into something thick and liquid. The plant itself was a collection of low concrete buildings connected by covered walkways, with a series of outdoor settling basins and a tall rectangular structure everyone called the tower, though it was only about 4 stories. The whole thing sat on maybe 12 acres behind a chain-link fence topped with angled barbed wire. There was a main gate with a keypad and a side gate near the employee lot that used the same code. My first night, a Monday in October, I showed up 20 minutes early because I didn't know how long it would take to find the place. The woman I was relieving was named Denise. She was in her 50s, heavy-set, with reading glasses on a lanyard and a fleece jacket that said Grayfield WRF on the chest. She seemed neither friendly nor unfriendly. She had the energy of someone who had explained this job to new people before and did not expect them to last. The control room was smaller than I'd pictured. 2 desks pushed together in an L shape, 1 rolling chair, a bank of 8 monitors mounted on the wall, a radio, a desk phone, a plastic clipboard with the nightly log sheets, and a space heater plugged into a power strip on the floor. There was a mini fridge in the corner and a microwave on top of it. The ceiling tiles were water-stained. The fluorescent light overhead had a faint buzz that you could feel in your back teeth if you sat directly under it, so the chair had been positioned slightly off-center, which I thought was a nice touch from whoever figured that out. Denise walked me through the basics. The monitors showed feeds from 8 cameras, 4 were exterior. The front gate, the side gate, the employee lot, and a wide shot of the settling basins. 4 were interior, the main hallway, the pump room, the chemical storage corridor, and something labeled KM7 sublevel that showed a concrete stairwell descending out of frame. The 8th monitor was just a dark feed. She said it was supposed to show the inside of the tower, but the camera had been broken for months and nobody had come to fix it. The job was simple. Every hour on the hour, you checked the pressure gauges on a panel next to the monitors. If any reading went outside the green band, you called an emergency maintenance number taped to the desk phone. You logged the readings on the clipboard. Every 2 hours, you did a walkthrough of the main building, the hallway, the pump room, the chemical storage area, to check for leaks, unusual sounds, or anything that looked off. You carried a flashlight in the radio, though Denise said the radio was mostly useless because there was nobody on the other end until the day shift started. Between checks, you could read, watch things on your phone, eat, whatever. She said most people just sat there. Before she left, she pulled a laminated card out of the desk drawer and set it on the desk in front of me. It was about the size of a recipe card, slightly yellowed around the edges with text printed in a plain font. She said it was the shift protocol card and that every overnight person got one. She told me to read it and keep it in the drawer. The card listed 7 items. Most of them were straightforward. Lock the main entrance after the evening shift leaves. Do not prop open the chemical storage door. If the fire panel activates, check for false alarms before calling dispatch. Keep the control room door closed at all times during shift. Log any equipment malfunctions in the incident column. The 6th item said, between 2:00 a.m. and 4:00 a.m., do not descend to the sub-level for any reason. The 7th item said, if KM7 shows movement during this window, note the time in your log. Do not investigate. I read the card twice. Then I looked at Denise, who was putting on her coat. I asked her about the last 2 items. She shrugged and said that's what the card says. I asked her if there was a reason. She said she'd never gone down there during those hours and never seen movement on the camera, so it had never come up. I asked her who wrote the card. She said it had been in the drawer when she started 4 years ago. She told me to have a good night and left. I listened to her car start in the lot. The headlights swept across the window set high in the control room wall, and then she was gone. The facility settled into its nighttime state. The pumps in the adjacent room produced a low, constant vibration that traveled through the floor. The fluorescent light buzzed. The space heater clicked. Outside, I could hear wind pushing against the metal roof panels of the walkway that connected the control room to the main building. For the first few hours, everything was routine. I did my gauge readings at midnight and they were all in the green. I did my first walkthrough at midnight as well, just to get it out of the way. The main building was well lit but empty. The hallway had that particular quality of institutional corridors at night. The way your footsteps sound like they belong to someone slightly larger than you. The way the air feels still and recycled. The way every door you pass feels like it might open. The pump room was loud and warm and full of massive green-painted machinery that vibrated against the concrete floor. Chemical storage smelled like chlorine and rust. I checked for leaks, found nothing, and walked back to the control room. The whole thing took about 15 minutes. I ate the sandwich I'd brought. I scrolled through my phone. The cell signal out there was unreliable. 1 bar that would occasionally flicker to 2, so anything that required loading took a long time. I read a few articles, got bored, and watched the monitors for a while. The exterior cameras were uninteresting. The settling basins sat motionless under the orange lights, their surfaces dark and flat. The parking lot held only my car. The gates were closed. Inside, the hallway was empty. The pump room showed the same machines doing the same thing. Chemical storage was still. KM7 showed the same concrete stairwell, lit by a single overhead fixture, descending into what looked like a sharp left turn at the bottom. The 8th monitor remained black. At 1 o'clock, I did my gauge readings. At 2, I did another walkthrough, this time only of the main level because the card's restriction had just kicked in. I remember standing in the hallway near the door that led to the sub-level stairs and looking at it. It was a heavy metal door, painted gray, with a small window of wired safety glass at head height. Through the glass, I could see the top of the stairwell, the same view as KM7, essentially, just from a slightly different angle. The stairs went down about a dozen steps and turned left. The lighting was that flat institutional white. Nothing moved. The door had a push bar on my side and what looked like a key lock on the other. I didn't try it. I finished my walkthrough and went back to the control room. At 2:15, I glanced at KM7 out of reflex and noticed something that I almost didn't register. The light at the bottom of the stairwell was off. The feed still showed the upper portion of the stairs clearly, but below the turn where there should have been a faint glow reflecting off the wall, there was just black. It was the kind of thing you might not catch unless you'd been staring at the feed on and off for 3 hours and had unconsciously memorized its baseline. I looked at it for a long time, then I decided the bulb had probably burned out. These things happened in old facilities. I wrote 2:15 a.m. Sublevel stairwell, lower light appears out in the log, and went back to my phone. 20 minutes later, I looked at the feed again. The light was back on. I stared at the monitor. The stairwell looked exactly as it had all night. Concrete steps, metal railing, overhead fixture, faint illumination reflecting from below the turn. All normal. I looked at what I'd written in the log. The ink was right there. I hadn't imagined it. I told myself the bulb was on a motion sensor, or there was a short in the wiring, or the camera's light balance had auto-adjusted and made it look darker than it was. These were all reasonable explanations. I wrote 2:37 a.m. Light appears restored. Possible electrical intermittent in the log, and moved on. Nothing else happened for the rest of the shift. At 4, the restriction window ended. I did my walkthrough at 4:15, and this time I opened the sub-level door and stood at the top of the stairs. The light was on, steady and bright. The stairwell smelled like damp concrete and something faintly metallic, like old water. The stairs descended and turned left. Around the corner, I could see the edge of another corridor, lit by the same kind of overhead fixtures. I didn't go down. There was no reason to, and something about the stillness of the air down there discouraged it. I closed the door and went back to the control room. The day shift supervisor arrived at 6:45. His name was Phil. He was a lean, weathered man with a Grayfield WRF polo shirt and a county ID badge on a retractable clip. He asked how the night went. I said fine. He signed the log without reading it closely, which I noticed. I gathered my things and drove home in the gray early morning light, watching the sun come up in my rear-view mirror, and slept until 2 in the afternoon. The second night was almost identical. Gauge readings, walkthroughs, quiet monitors, stale air, buzzing light. I brought a book this time, a paperback thriller I'd found in a box at Goodwill. The control room felt less unfamiliar. I'd learned its sounds, the rhythm of the pumps, the heater's click-on cycle, the particular way the wind found gaps in the roof sheeting and produced a low whistle that came and went. At 1:45, I started paying closer attention to Cam 7. I don't know what I expected. I think I wanted to confirm the light had been a fluke. At 2:08, the lower light went out again. Same as before. The upper stairwell remained lit, but the area below the turn went black. I leaned closer to the monitor. The contrast between the lit upper stairs and the darkness below was sharp. It wasn't a gradual dimming. It was as though something had blocked the light, rather than the bulb going off. I watched for maybe 2 minutes. Then the darkness below the turn shifted. That's the only word I can use. It wasn't movement in the way a person moves. It was more like the quality of the darkness itself changed. Became denser in one spot, thinner in another, like something rearranging itself in the black. I told myself it was video noise. Old cameras produce artifacts, especially in low light. Compression does strange things to dark areas of a frame. Everyone who has ever watched surveillance footage knows this. At 2:23, the light came back. Everything looked normal. I logged both times and went back to my book. My hands were steady. I wasn't scared. I was annoyed, mostly, because I couldn't explain it, and I don't like not being able to explain things. The third night is when the pattern became undeniable. I'd spent part of the afternoon thinking about the sublevel, which irritated me. I looked up the Grayfield facility online and found almost nothing. A county infrastructure page listed it as a Class B reclamation plant commissioned in 1987. There was a brief mention in a 2019 county budget document about deferred maintenance, no photos of the interior, no employee reviews on any job site. The listing I'd applied through had already been taken down, which wasn't unusual. County postings cycled quickly. But it added to the feeling that this place existed in a kind of administrative gap, known to the people who worked there, and essentially invisible to everyone else. That night I arrived early again. The evening shift had already left. The lot was empty, except for my car. I let myself in, locked the main entrance, settled into the control room, and started the routine. At exactly 2 o'clock, the lower light on KM7 went out. I watched the monitor steadily this time. I'd positioned my chair directly in front of it. The upper stairwell was bright and empty. Below the turn, nothing but black. For about 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then I saw it again. That shifting quality in the dark area, it was subtle. If I looked directly at it, I couldn't be sure it was happening. If I looked slightly to the side and let my peripheral vision take over, the movement became clearer. Something was down there, adjusting, repositioning, not coming up the stairs, not leaving. Just existing in the dark below the turn in a way that occasionally displaced the darkness around it. At 2:31, something new happened. The camera feed developed a faint horizontal line of static across the lower third. It wasn't dramatic, just a thin band of visual noise that scrolled slowly upward and then disappeared. It happened twice more over the next 15 minutes. Each time, the static band seemed slightly thicker. At 2:55, 5 minutes before the end of the window, the light below the turn came back on. The stairwell was empty. The static stopped. KM7 showed exactly what it always showed during normal hours. A concrete stairwell with nobody in it. I logged everything. Times, descriptions, duration. I was meticulous about it because I wanted a record, not because I thought anyone would read it. Phil hadn't looked at a single log entry in detail since I'd started. The fourth night I decided to test something. At 1:50, 10 minutes before the window, I walked to the sublevel door and looked through the wired glass. The stairwell was bright, empty, normal. At 1:58, I was still standing there. At 2:01, the lower light went out. I watched it happen in real time, through the glass, not on a monitor. The light at the bottom of the stairs didn't flicker, didn't dim gradually. It simply stopped, as though a switch had been thrown. And in the darkness below the turn, where a moment ago there had been visible tile floor and the corner of a wall, there was now nothing, just dark. I stood at that door for 3 minutes. The air coming through the gap at the bottom of the door frame was cold, colder than it should have been given that the sublevel was insulated and climate controlled, the same as the rest of the building. The cold had a texture to it. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but if you've ever stood near a walk-in freezer or at the mouth of a cave, you know what I mean. It wasn't just an absence of heat. It felt like the cold was actively radiating from somewhere below, pushing outward, filling the stairwell from the bottom up. I went back to the control room and watched the rest of the window on the monitor. The same pattern. Shifting dark, faint static, light returning just before 4. On my drive home that morning, I stopped at a gas station and bought a coffee I didn't need. I sat in the parking lot and watched the sun come up and tried to organize what I knew. The facts were simple. Between 2 and 4 every night, something happened in the sublevel stairwell. The light at the bottom went out. Something occupied the dark space below the turn. The camera registered it as visual noise. The air temperature dropped. At 4, everything returned to normal. The protocol card told me not to go down there during the window and not to investigate movement on KM7. It told me to log it. The card was old and had been in the drawer for years. Denise had followed it without incident for 4 years. Presumably other overnight techs before her had done the same. The card existed because someone at some point had determined these instructions were necessary. And the fact that they were presented without explanation suggested that the explanation either didn't exist or was considered something you were better off not having. I should tell you that I am not someone who believes in the supernatural. I grew up in a household that went to church on Easter and Christmas and otherwise didn't discuss spiritual matters. I studied electrical engineering for 2 years at a community college. Before dropping out for financial reasons, my worldview is mechanical. Things have causes, effects follow inputs. The universe is a system and systems can be understood. But I also know from working in enough old buildings and industrial spaces that there are things about the physical world that don't always cooperate with tidy explanations. Structures settle in ways engineers didn't predict. Electrical systems develop behaviors that aren't in any wiring diagram. Water finds paths through concrete that no one designed. These aren't supernatural events, they're just gaps between what a building was meant to do and what it actually does over decades of use. I assumed the sub-level situation was something like that. Some combination of aging infrastructure, unusual conditions, and the human tendency to find patterns in ambiguous data. That assumption held until my 7th night. By then, I'd developed a routine with the window. At 2, I'd position myself at the monitors. I'd watch Cam 7, log the light going out, note any visual anomalies, and wait for it to reset at 4. It had become almost mundane. The darkness below the turn did its shifting thing. The static appeared occasionally. The temperature near the sub-level door dropped. Everything reset. I did my job. On the 7th night at 2:40, something different happened. I was watching the monitor when the darkness below the turn began to move upward. I don't mean something walked up the stairs. I mean the darkness itself ascended. The boundary between the lit upper stairwell and the black lower portion, which had always been fixed at the turn, began to creep higher. One step, then another. The overhead light at the top of the stairs was still on, still bright, but the dark was rising like water, swallowing each step from the bottom up. In the monitor, it looked like someone was slowly raising a black curtain from below, covering the stairwell inch by inch. It stopped about 3 steps from the top. On the screen, I could see just the upper landing and the back of the sub-level door, and below that, a wall of black starting at the 3rd step down. The static on the feed became heavy. Thick bands rolling across the entire image, breaking up the picture every few seconds. I looked at the clock. 2:44. I looked back at the monitor. The darkness held its position. It didn't move higher. It didn't recede. It just sat there. 3 steps from the top, like it was waiting. I got up from the chair and walked to the sub-level door. I don't know why I did this. It wasn't courage. It was something closer to compulsion, the need to see with my own eyes whether what the camera showed was real. I stood at the door and looked through the wired glass. The stairwell was bright. All the lights were on, every single one. The stairs descended, turned left, and I could see the faint glow from the lower corridor reflecting off the wall at the turn. Nothing dark, nothing rising, nothing at all. I walked back to the control room. On the monitor, Cam 7 still showed the darkness holding at the 3rd step. Static bands rolled through the image. I looked through the window, bright and empty. I looked at the monitor, dark and occupied. One of these was real and one of these was not, or both were real in a way I couldn't reconcile, or I was losing my mind from sleep deprivation and overnight shifts, which was also a possibility I had to take seriously. I sat down and wrote everything in the log with the kind of precision that comes from wanting to impose order on something that refuses to be ordered. I noted the times, the visual characteristics, the discrepancy between the camera feed and direct observation. I used neutral language. I did not write, "Something is in the stairwell." I wrote, "KM7 feed does not correspond to visual inspection of sub-level stairwell. Possible camera malfunction or signal interference." At 4, the monitor returned to normal. The darkness on the feed receded. The stairwell on screen matched the stairwell through the door. I did my walkthrough at 4:15 and everything was quiet. The next afternoon before my shift, I went to the county public works office. It was in a strip mall near the courthouse, between a tax preparer and a nail salon. I asked to speak to someone about the Grayfield facility. The woman at the front desk made a phone call and then told me that the facilities coordinator was out, but I could leave a message. I wrote a note asking about the sub-level of the Grayfield plant, specifically what it was used for when it was last inspected, and whether there were any known electrical or camera issues. I left my number. No one ever called me back. I tried a different approach. The next night during my shift, I called the emergency maintenance number on the desk phone. A man answered. He sounded like I'd woken him up. I told him I was the overnight tech at Grayfield and that I was getting anomalous readings on one of the security cameras. He asked which camera. I said KM7, the sub-level. There was a pause. Then he said he'd put in a work order. I asked if he knew anything about the sub-level, what was down there, why the protocol card had restrictions about it. He said he was just the maintenance dispatch and didn't have information about specific site protocols. He suggested I talk to my supervisor. The work order, as far as I know, was never fulfilled. I asked Phil the next morning. I tried to be casual about it. I said the sub-level camera had been acting up and asked if he knew what was down there. Phil said it was the old filtration gallery, the original water treatment equipment from when the plant was built in the 80s. Most of it had been decommissioned when they upgraded the systems in 2004. There were some electrical panels down there and a backup pump that hadn't been used in years. He said the sub-level had been mostly sealed off because there was a mold issue a few years back and the county didn't want to pay for remediation. I asked about the protocol card restriction. He said he wasn't familiar with the specific contents of the overnight shift card and that the overnight procedures were set before his time. He suggested that the sub-level restriction was probably related to the mold. They didn't want anyone going down there without proper equipment. That explanation made sense. It was practical and boring and exactly the kind of thing that would be true about a county facility with deferred maintenance, except it didn't explain the camera, the darkness, the cold air, or the fact that the protocol card specifically mentioned movement on the feed and told you to log it. You don't tell someone to log mold. On the 9th night, I found the notebook. I was looking for a pen in the desk drawer during a slow stretch around midnight. The drawer was full of the usual workplace debris, dried out markers, a stapler with no staples, rubber bands, a county HR pamphlet from 2016, loose paper clips. Underneath it all, pushed to the back, was a small spiral-bound notebook, the kind you can buy in a 3-pack at a dollar store. It had a blue cover, no label. The wire spiral was partially bent. I opened it. The first page had a name written at the top in blue pen, Terry K. Below the name was a date, June 2019. The handwriting was small and neat, the kind of writing that belongs to someone who learned cursive properly and still uses it. What followed was a series of dated entries, each one brief, written in a style that I recognized immediately. They were shift notes, personal ones, not the official log. Terry Kay had worked the overnight shift and had been keeping her own record. The early entries were mundane: equipment notes, weather observations, complaints about the heater, a mention of a raccoon that kept triggering the exterior motion light near the settling basins. Then, about 10 pages in, the entries changed. June 14th, cam 7, dark below turn at 2:05, back at 3:48, no sound. June 15th, same, dark at 2 o'clock exactly, something in the dark. Looks like static, but it's not. It moves wrong. June 18th, went to the door tonight. Cold, much colder than it should be, didn't open it. June 22nd, cam 7, showing dark higher than before. Almost to the top, static, very bad. Logged it. Nobody asks about the logs. June 25, heard something. That entry stopped there. No description of the sound. Just those two words and a period. The entries continued, but the gaps between them grew longer. The handwriting became less neat. Some entries were only a line or two. Others were crossed out. One page had a single sentence: "It knows when I'm watching." The last entry was dated July 9th, 2019. It read, "They want me to go down. I don't know how I know that. I'm putting in my 2 weeks." There was nothing after that. The rest of the notebook was blank. I sat with the notebook in my hands for a long time. The pumps hummed through the floor. The heater clicked. On the monitors, the facility sat quiet under the orange lights. CM7 showed an empty stairwell. It was 12:40 in the morning, and the window wouldn't start for another 80 minutes, and I was already thinking about it. I put the notebook back in the drawer. I don't know why I didn't take it with me. Maybe I thought it belonged to the place, that removing it would somehow break whatever equilibrium the facility had settled into. Or maybe I just didn't want it in my apartment, sitting on my nightstand, being real in my daily life. The 10th night was different in a way that took me hours to notice. My shift started normally. I did the gauge readings at midnight, did my walkthrough, came back to the control room. I checked my phone, ate an apple, drank water from the jug I'd started bringing because the building's water fountain was in the main hallway, and I didn't like walking out there more than necessary. At 1 o'clock, I did the readings again. Everything green. At 1:30, I glanced at the monitors and realized that the 8th monitor, the one Denise had said was broken, the one connected to the tower camera, was on. Not fully on, it wasn't showing a clear image, but it was no longer black. It was displaying a dark gray field with faint shapes, like a camera struggling to resolve an image in very low light. I could make out what might have been vertical lines, structural supports or walls, and a lighter area near the top that could have been a window or an opening. The picture was grainy and unstable, with occasional flickers that suggested the camera was receiving power but barely functioning. I looked at it for a long time. I had walked past the tower during my exterior checks on clear nights. It was the tallest structure at the facility, a rectangular concrete building with a corrugated metal cap on top and narrow slit windows at each level. From the outside, it looked utilitarian and inert. The door at its base was padlocked. I had never been inside and had no reason to go. Now the camera was showing me the inside, or trying to. At 1:55, I turned my attention to CM7 in preparation for the window. At 2:01, the sub-level light went out on schedule. The darkness settled in below the turn. I noted it in the log. It was becoming routine, which is a strange thing to say about something I couldn't explain, but that's how adaptation works. The mind reclassifies threats as environmental features if they remain consistent and don't escalate. Except tonight they escalated. At 2:20, the darkness on KM7 was higher than I'd ever seen it. Not at the third step, not at the fifth. It was at the top of the stairs, filling the entire frame except for a small area at the very top where the landing met the door. The static was thick, heavy bands of visual distortion that made the remaining visible area pulse and swim. And on the 8th monitor, the gray image had become clearer. I could now see what was definitely the interior of the tower. A tall open space with catwalks running along the walls and a central column of dark metal that extended from floor to ceiling. The image had a greenish cast, like a night vision feed, without proper calibration. At one of the catwalks, roughly at the second level, there was a shape. It was indistinct, blurred by the camera's limitations, but it was there, a darker area against the already dark background, roughly the size and proportion of a person standing at the railing and looking down. I stared at it. I tried to determine if it was a shadow, a structural feature, an artifact. It didn't move, but it also didn't look like it belonged to the architecture around it. The lines of the catwalk railing passed behind it. It was in front of the railing, not part of it. At 2:38, the shape on the tower camera was gone. I checked back to cam7. The darkness had receded slightly. It was now at the 5th step, pulling back like a tide. The static was lessening. At 2:41, every monitor in the control room went black. All 8 simultaneously. The room dropped into near darkness. The only light came from the power LEDs on the monitor bezels, the glow of the space heater, and the green indicator lights on the pressure gauge panel. The fluorescent overhead was still on, buzzing away, but the sudden loss of the monitor glow changed the feel of the room completely. I waited. I counted to 30. The monitors didn't come back. I checked the power strip they were connected to. The switch was still on. I pressed it off and on again. Nothing. I checked the cable connections at the back of the recording unit, a boxy gray device mounted under the desk. The cables were seated properly. The unit's power light was on, but the activity light, which usually blinked steadily, was dark. I picked up the desk phone and called the maintenance number. It rang 12 times. No answer. I hung up and tried again. Same result. I set the phone down and sat in the dim control room and listened to the building. The pumps were still running. The heater was still clicking. The wind was still finding the gaps in the roof. But underneath those familiar sounds, there was something else. A sound I hadn't heard before. Low, almost below the threshold of hearing, more felt than heard. A vibration that didn't match the pump frequency. It was irregular. It would build for a few seconds, sustain, then drop away, then build again. It was coming from somewhere below me. The control room was on the ground floor of the main building. Below the main building was the sub-level. The sound was coming from the sub-level. I sat very still. The clock on the wall read 2:49. I was inside the window. The card told me not to go down there. The notebook told me Terry Kay had left because she felt something wanted her to go down there. Every rational thought in my head told me to sit in the chair and wait for 4 o'clock. The vibration grew stronger. Not louder exactly, but more present, like it was saturating the floor and walls, becoming part of the building's structure. The surface of the water in my jug trembled faintly. The loose paper clips in the desk drawer rattled against each other with a sound like tiny bells. At 2:56, the monitors came back. All 8 simultaneously, with a burst of static across every screen that resolved into their normal feeds within seconds. The exterior cameras showed the same empty facility. The hallway was empty. The pump room was working. Chemical storage was still. KM7 showed a fully lit, completely normal stairwell. The 8th monitor was black again. The vibrations stopped. I sat in the chair and breathed and did not move for a long time. Then I wrote everything in the log. Every detail, every time, every observation. I used up 2 rows of the log sheet. I wrote in small, careful letters. And when I was done, I read it back. And it all sounded insane. Like the ramblings of someone who needed sleep and a different job. But it was accurate. It was what had happened. At 4, I did my walkthrough. The sub-level door was closed. Through the glass, the stairwell was bright and empty. The air at the base of the door was room temperature. Normal. I walked the hallway, checked the pump room, checked chemical storage. Everything was as it should be. The building had returned to being a building. Mundane and indifferent. I worked 3 more nights after that. Each one followed the same pattern during the window. Lights out on KM7. Darkness in the stairwell. Static. A sense of something present. But the darkness never rose above the 5th step again. The 8th monitor stayed black. The vibration didn't return. Whatever had happened on the 10th night seemed to have been a peak, an apex of something I didn't understand, and the system had returned to its baseline afterward. On my 14th night, I found something in the sub-level stairwell during my 4:15 walkthrough. It was a small detail, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking. On the wall at the turn of the stairs, where the upper flight met the lower corridor, someone had scratched something into the paint. It was at about waist height, partially hidden by the handrail. 3 letters and a number. FK11. I stared at it. The scratching was old. The edges of the letters had been softened by layers of institutional paint applied over them. But whoever had done it had pressed hard enough that the impression remained. FK could have been initials. 11 could have been anything. A date, a floor, a count, a code. There was no context. It was just there, in the stairwell, where the darkness lived at night, scratched into the wall by someone whose hand I could almost picture, but whose reason I could not. I didn't write it in the official log. I wrote it in the margins of my own notes, which I'd started keeping on folded sheets of paper in my jacket pocket. Then I went back to the control room and finished my shift. I gave my 2 weeks' notice the following Monday. Phil asked if it was the overnight schedule. I said yes, which was partially true. He said they had trouble keeping people on that shift. He didn't elaborate and I didn't ask. During my remaining shifts, the window pattern continued without deviation. Lights out at 2 on KM7, darkness below the turn, faint static, everything resetting at 4. I logged it each time. I didn't go to the sub-level door anymore. I didn't watch the darkness with the same attention I had before. I had seen what I needed to see, which was that the phenomenon was consistent, enduring, and completely disinterested in whether I understood it or not. My last night was a Thursday. The shift was quiet. The facility hummed and clicked and settled around me the way it always did. At 2, the sub-level light went out. At 4, it came back. I did my final walkthrough, locked up, and waited for the day shift. Phil arrived at 6:45. He signed my last log sheet and shook my hand and said, "Good luck." I drove home as the sun came up. The county road unwound behind me, and the sodium lights at the facility faded to specks in my mirror, and then to nothing. I had my last paycheck direct deposited 3 days later. I found a daytime job at a hardware distribution warehouse within the month. I never went back to Grayfield. But I think about it, not constantly and not with the kind of dramatic haunting that stories like this usually end with. It's more like the way you think about a place you lived once that you never fully mapped. A house with a room you never entered, a neighborhood with a street you never walked down. There's an incompleteness to it that nags at the edges of your attention when you're doing other things, when your mind is idle, when you're lying in bed and the building around you makes its nighttime sounds. I think about Terry Kay and her notebook and the way her handwriting deteriorated over those weeks. I think about the protocol card in the drawer and who typed it and laminated it and put it there, and what they had seen that made them decide the correct response was not to fix the problem, but to manage it, to build a set of rules around it like a fence around a sinkhole. I think about FK11 scratched into the wall at the turn of the stairs, and whether those were initials and a number or something else entirely, something whose meaning belonged to a context I would never have access to. Mostly I think about the 10th night, the night the monitors went dark and the vibration came up through the floor, and the paper clips rang in the drawer like someone had struck a tuning fork deep underground. I think about what it felt like to sit in that control room with nothing but a space heater and a buzzing fluorescent light, and know, with the certainty that comes from having run out of other explanations, that something underneath me was aware of my presence. Not hostile, necessarily, not benign either, just aware. The way a house is aware of the weather, the way deep water is aware of a boat on its surface. A vast, patient, structural awareness with no interest in communication and no need for my understanding. I think about the fact that I left my log sheets there with everything documented in my careful handwriting, and that Phil probably filed them without reading them, and that they're sitting in a drawer or a cabinet somewhere in that facility right now. If someone finds them, they'll see the entries from the window hours, the times, the descriptions, the discrepancies between camera and observation, and maybe they'll read them and think the overnight tech was losing it, or maybe they'll read them and recognize what they're describing because they've seen it too. Because they're the next person sitting in that chair, under the buzzing light, watching Cam 7 at 2 a.m, waiting for the darkness to come. The facility is still operational, as far as I know. The county still runs it. The overnight shift still needs to be filled. The last time I checked the employment board about 3 months after I left, the listing was up again. Same title, same pay, same hours, no experience necessary. I don't know what's in the sub-level. I don't know what the decommissioned filtration gallery holds or doesn't hold, or what happens in the stairwell between 2 and 4 a.m. I don't know if Terry Kay is fine or not fine. I don't know whose initials are scratched into the wall or what the number means. I don't know why the tower camera flickered on for one night and showed me what it showed me and then went dark again. What I know is this: someone at some point sat where I sat and watched what I watched and decided the appropriate response was not to run, not to investigate, not to report it to someone who might act, but to write 7 items on a laminated card and put it in a drawer. And the fact that they chose containment over confrontation tells me more than any explanation ever could. They didn't understand it either, but they understood enough to know that the right thing to do was to watch the monitors, log the time, stay out of the stairwell, and wait for morning. So that's what I did. Every night for 3.5 weeks, I sat in the chair and waited for morning, and morning always came. The sun would clear the tree line east of the facility, and the orange sodium lights would click off one by one, and the building would go back to being just a building, concrete and steel and pumps and chemicals and all the boring infrastructure that makes a small city's water drinkable. But between 2 and 4, it was something else. And I don't have a word for what, and I've stopped trying to find one. Some things don't have explanations. Some things just have protocols. And the protocol said, don't go down there, so I didn't, and whatever was down there stayed down there. And that, I think, was the arrangement. Not a truce, exactly. Not an understanding, just a boundary, observed on both sides, for reasons neither side could name. I sleep fine most nights. I work days now. The hardware warehouse is loud and bright and full of people and forklifts and the smell of cut lumber and machine oil. And nothing about it is quiet or still or underground. But sometimes if I'm in the building after hours, if I've stayed late to finish inventory or close out a shipment, and the overhead lights are on their half setting, and the building is empty except for me and the security system's soft red pulse, I'll hear something. Not the vibration, not exactly, more like the memory of the vibration, a resonance in my bones that isn't really there but feels like it could be. And I'll stand still for a moment and listen. And it's always nothing, just a building being a building, pipes and ducts, and electricity doing what they do. But I listen anyway, because I learned something at Grayfield that I can't unlearn. The world has layers. Most of the time you only live on the surface. You walk on the ground floor and don't think about what's underneath. You sleep in your bed and don't think about the foundation. You drink the water and don't think about where it was before it came out of the tap, what it passed through, what sat in it, what dark and pressurized space it occupied before someone cleaned it and pushed it through a pipe to your kitchen. Most of the time that's fine. The layers don't interact. The surface holds. The ground floor is the only floor you need. But sometimes in certain places at certain hours, the layers thin and something underneath becomes aware of something above. And the only thing between you and it is a door you were told not to open, a stairwell you were told not to descend, and a laminated card in a drawer that someone made a long time ago because they believed, correctly, that some things are better left documented than understood. I still have the folded notes from my jacket pocket. They're in a shoebox in my closet with old pay stubs and expired insurance cards. Sometimes I think about throwing them away. Sometimes I think about going back to the county employment board and seeing if the listing is still up. I don't do either. I leave the notes in the box. I leave the listing unclicked. And at night when the warehouse is locked up and I'm driving home on well-lit roads with other cars and street lights and the comfortable noise of a living town around me, I don't think about Grayfield at all. Almost.